If you're gonna be a rock, be a rock. Don't be a bug.
Oh, don't do that to me, man. I nearly pissed my pants.
Screamers is the science fiction film that was written by the man behind Alien, based on a story that inspired The Terminator, and made without either of them knowing about it, directed by Christian Duguay, and starring Peter Weller. It cost $14 million and grossed $5.7 million. Here are 12 facts you never knew. Fact 12. The ending that changed what the story was about Philip K. Dick's Second Variety ends with the protagonist escaping Earth on a rocket headed for the Soviet Union, only to discover in the story's final lines that the woman aboard the ship with him is another screamer. There is no hope. The machines have won. The escape was the last illusion. O'Bannon kept that structural logic. Hendrickson escapes Sirius 6B, reaches a transport and discovers that his companion Jessica may be a screamer. The film closes on that revelation, and on the transmission, Hendrickson sends warning Earth. The ending the production originally leaned toward was bleaker and more faithful to Dick's intentions, a harder, more final confirmation that the screamers had already reached Earth before the warning could matter. What made it to theaters was deliberately more ambiguous. Hendrickson sends the message, the screen cuts. Audiences weren't sure whether the warning arrived in time or whether it was already too late. The uncertainty was intentional thought, but test screenings had indicated that the harder version felt too punishing without a note of possibility. Dick's ending had no possibility at all. The film gave audiences just enough light to argue about in the parking lot. Whether that was the right compromise is a question the story itself refuses to answer. Fact 11. Dan O'Bannon found out his film existed from his agent. When Screamers finally went into production, nobody called Dan O'Bannon. He had written the script in 1981, watched it sit in development for 14 years, and eventually stopped thinking about it. And the first time he learned the film had been made was after its release, and when his agent called to tell him he had a screenwriting credit on a finished movie. A script he had written over a decade earlier had been optioned, rewritten by another writer, filmed in Canada, completed, screened at the Toronto International Film Festival, and acquired for distribution without O'Bannon receiving a single notification at any stage of the process. His original characters and plot structure had been kept largely intact. His dialogue had been substantially rewritten by Miguel Tejada Flores. He received credit for both. The man who wrote Alien found out his second Philip K. Dick adaptation existed the same way a stranger would have, and after it was already in theaters. Fact 10. The original story was set during the Cold War. On Earth, Philip K. Dick's Second Variety was published in 1953 and was explicitly a Cold War story. The conflict was between the United Nations and Soviet Russia, a ground war fought on a ravaged Earth, not a distant mining planet. The screamers in the original story were American weapons turned against their creators, and the geopolitical anxiety driving the narrative was the specific nuclear terror of the early 1950s. O'Bannon's adaptation made one fundamental change that shaped everything else. He moved the action to Sirius 6B, a distant mining colony, severing the Cold War context entirely. The move was deliberate. It allowed the story's themes about automated weapons and blurred identity to exist without a specific political target. It also linked the material thematically to O'Bannon's work on Alien, which had similarly placed industrial labor and corporate exploitation in a deep space setting. The story that Dick wrote about 1953 became, in O'Bannon's hands, a story about 2078. Fact 9. Montreal's Olympic Stadium doubled as an alien planet. The entire film was shot in Quebec, Canada, and most of what looks like a devastated alien wasteland was captured at real locations within driving distance of Montreal. The barren industrial exteriors were filmed at a quarry in Joliet, Quebec. The sprawling military base interiors and connecting corridors were shot at Montreal's Olympic Stadium, the facility built for the 1976 Summer Olympics that had been sitting largely underutilized for years. The stadium's brutalist concrete architecture, its vast scale, and its institutional coldness gave the sets a physical credibility that a conventional soundstage couldn't have produced at the film's budget level. Production designer Perry Guerrara dressed the stadium interiors with enough military hardware and post-apocalyptic detail that the locations read as something entirely alien A $14 million science fiction film built a convincing distant planet from a quarry and an Olympic venue. It looked better than it had any right to. Fact 8. The director had only made Scanners sequels. Before this, Christian Duguay came to Screamers on the strength of 2 straight-to-video productions of Scanners 2, The New Order, and Scanners 3, The Takeover, both shot back-to-back in Canada as follow-ups to David Cronenberg's cult horror film. Neither was a critical success. Both demonstrated that Duguay could manage genre filmmaking within tight constraints and deliver something watchable under difficult conditions. Allegro Films knew what they were getting, a Canadian director who understood how to stretch a modest budget and had already navigated the demands of science fiction production twice. Duguay brought genuine visual ambition to the film. The Matisse paintings depicting the devastated surface of Sirius 6B were praised even by critics who found everything else disappointing. The stop-motion effects for the Type 1 Screamer, the small, fast, blade-wielding device that moves through the sand, received specific commendation for their tactile quality. A director whose entire resume consisted of Cronenberg sequels delivered effects work that stood up against productions with considerably more resources. Fact 7. Peter Weller brought RoboCop's physicality to a completely different role. Peter Weller had spent 2 films playing RoboCop, a role that required him to move with precise mechanical restraint inside a costume that allowed almost no natural human expression. Screamers asked something different. Hendrickson is a man exhausted by war, morally compromised by survival, and increasingly uncertain about the nature of the people around him. Weller brought to the role the same quality he had used as Alex Murphy, a physical stillness that read as controlled rather than cold, a way of inhabiting a scene without demanding its center. Critics who found little else to praise in Screamers consistently noted that Weller's presence elevated the material. He carried scenes that the script had underwritten. He made Hendrickson's paranoia feel earned rather than convenient. The actor who had learned to perform without facial expression inside a robot suit turned that discipline into something more nuanced for a character who could still feel things. It was a better performance than the film around it deserved. Fact 6. O'Bannon wrote 2 Philip K. Dick adaptations in the same year. In 1981, Dan O'Bannon completed 2 separate adaptations of Philip K. Dick's short stories within the same period. One was Screamers, his adaptation of Second Variety, which sat in development for 14 years. The other was We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which became Total Recall, released in 1990 and directed by Paul Verhoeven, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Total Recall earned $261 million worldwide and is considered one of the defining science fiction films of the 1990s. Screamers earned $5.7 million. Both scripts came from the same writer, working from the same source material pool. In the same year, one became a global phenomenon. The other spent 14 years in a filing cabinet before being made without its author's knowledge. O'Bannon's Philip K. Dick double feature of 1981 produced the most disproportionate pair of outcomes in science fiction adaptation history. Fact 5. The film arrived too late to influence what it had already inspired. If Screamers had been made when O'Bannon wrote it in 1981, it would have preceded The Terminator by 3 years. Dick's Second Variety and O'Bannon's adaptation features autonomous machines that evolve beyond their original programming to hunt and mimic human beings. That premise maps directly onto Terminator's Skynet narrative, onto aliens' android anxieties, onto the replicant question at the heart of Blade Runner. Critics in 1995 noted this overlap and called Screamers derivative. The irony is that the material predated most of what it was being compared to. O'Bannon's script existed before those films were made, but the production delays that kept it from being filmed meant it arrived after the films it might have influenced had already been made, released, and absorbed into the cultural vocabulary. Screamers looked like a copy. It was closer to a source. The 14 years it spent in development hell had turned an original into an imitation. Fact 4. The Genie Awards recognized it. Despite the box office, the Genie Awards, the Canadian Academy's annual recognition of achievement in Canadian film, nominated Screamers in multiple technical categories, including Best Achievement in Overall Sound and Best Achievement in Sound Editing. The nominations acknowledge what the box office had ignored, that within its budget constraints, the film's technical execution was genuinely accomplished. The sound design in particular was central to the Screamer experience. The high-pitched shriek of the Type 1 devices moving through the sand was one of the film's most effectively unsettling elements, built from layered recordings that the sound team had constructed specifically to produce physical discomfort in the audience. A film that grossed less than half its production budget walked away from the Canadian industry's premier awards ceremony with recognition for the craft that audiences hadn't shown up to experience. The genie saw what the box office missed. Fact 3, the sequel was made 14 years later. Without Peter Weller's Screamers, The Hunting was released in 2009, 14 years after the original, mirroring almost exactly the delay between O'Bannon's script and the first film's production. The sequel was a direct-to-video production directed by Sheldon Wilson, set on the same planet as the original, and dealing with the aftermath of Hendrickson's escape. Peter Weller did not return. The lead role went to Lance Henriksen, a casting choice that drew on Henriksen's established association with science fiction and android characters through Aliens and its sequels. The film received mixed reviews, with most critics acknowledging it was competent while agreeing it added nothing meaningful to the first film's ideas. The franchise, that had been built on a Philip K. Dick story about machines that evolved beyond their original purpose, produced a sequel that did the opposite. It remained exactly within the boundaries of what had already been done and went nowhere new. The Screamers evolved, the sequel didn't. Fact 2, the film is considered the most faithful Philip K. Dick adaptation. Philip K. Dick's work has been adapted many times. Blade Runner, Total Recall, Minority Report, A Scanner Darkly, The Adjustment Bureau. Most adaptations take significant liberties. Screamers is consistently cited by critics and Dick scholars as among the most faithful of all his film adaptations. The core philosophical questions of Second Variety survive intact. Who is human? How do you know? And what happens when the answer is no longer reliable? O'Bannon's decision to move the setting to deep space while preserving the story's moral architecture kept the themes clean. The film's central dread, that the people around Hendrickson might not be people, is Dick's dread, presented without the softening or spectacle that most adaptations use to make his ideas more palatable. A film dismissed on release as derivative and low budget was doing something that Blade Runner and Total Recall, for all their brilliance, had not fully attempted. It was being faithful to what Dick actually wrote, not just what he inspired. Fact 1, the script sat unproduced for 14 years. Dan O'Bannon finished his adaptation of Philip K. Dick's Second Variety in 1981. The same year he completed his adaptation of another Dick story, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which became Total Recall in 1990. O'Bannon's Screamer script was optioned in 1983 by Tom Nod, the SFX designer on the 1981 film Outland. Then nothing happened. The project drifted through development for over a decade, passing through the hands of producer Charles Freeze multiple times, attracting interest and then losing it, getting closer and then stalling again. By the time Montreal's Allegro Films finally put it into production in 1994, the script was 13 years old. The world it had been written for had moved on. The Terminator had arrived. Blade Runner had come and gone and been reassessed. Every theme the script had been quietly ahead of had since been explored by bigger films with bigger budgets. Screamers entered production already running behind the films it had influenced without knowing it, and there you have it, 12 weird facts about Screamers. A film written in 1981, made without its writer knowing, built inside an Olympic stadium, and still considered the most faithful Philip K. Dick adaptation ever filmed. Which fact hit hardest? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe for more deep dives into the sci-fi films that deserved a bigger audience. Until next time.